Right, in this video I'm going to explain what I mean by the title, give some examples looking at the MCU, contrast this with some other cinematic universes, and then conclude with an overall takedown of the film industry right now. So stick around until the end for that takedown, but in the meantime, let's jump into it. Okay, I realize that criticizing the MCU isn't exactly an original take right now. Guys, I think that maybe the MCU isn't very good. I think it's going downhill a bit. Probably should have quit while we were ahead. But before you bully me for being unoriginal, I did come up with the idea for this video in 2018 when Infinity War came out. In other words, back when the MCU was still good. Remember the Infinity Saga when Marvel was good? Remember how good Infinity War was? Wait, isn't that crazy? Infinity War was good. Think about this for a second. Avengers Infinity War starts off with some mythological Norsemen leaving Asgard after it was destroyed by a giant lava monster, when they get attacked by a giant purple alien who wants to use these magic gems from the creation of the universe to wipe out half of all life. And the team trying to stop him is made up of a Norse god and some aliens from space, one of whom is a talking raccoon. There's also a man in a robot suit, a guy from World War II, and a wizard who has mastered ancient Asian magic. There's actually two wizards. The other wizard is in a relationship with an AI butler. The main fight takes place in a secret African kingdom where they have super advanced technology due to a magic comet that landed there. Then it ends with the bad guy winning and half the main cast get turned into dust. And yeah, I feel like pinching myself when I say it, but that was a good movie. Somehow they took that plot description and they made it good. But that's the problem. 99 times out of 100, that movie I just explained there flops so hard. It would be jumbled and bloated and unfocused and everyone would hate it. But somehow they made it work. And that's incredible. The issue is, if you then keep going and keep making more movies, eventually you're going to fail to capture the lightning in a bottle that somehow made Infinity War work. Failure is inevitable. My argument is that the MCU somehow had a pretty good run, but it shouldn't have, because there are issues with the entire idea of an expanded universe for all these different characters, and now those issues have caught up with the MCU. I think an expanded universe is an interesting idea, and that idea does have some obvious potential benefits. Like, let me take the hypothetical example of an expanded universe that combines Star Wars with The Lord of the Rings. Okay, why might that be good? Firstly, it would just be more expansive. In some sense, why would you not want more of a good thing? And now we can get more Star Wars and more Lord of the Rings at the same time. Secondly, this means more characters. Each movie doesn't have to set up its own cast of characters. With an expanded universe, they can just bring in all the characters we already love. Thirdly, the lore would be more intricate, and if this is done well, it could be quite satisfying. How would the lore of Star Wars and of Tolkien's Legendarium come together? If they are able to make it work, then it would be really interesting. In summary, such an expanded universe would just be more epic. You're taking two of the most iconic fantasy action adventure franchises of all time and putting them together. The universe is twice as big, the lore is twice as deep, and you can bet the battles are going to be twice as awesome. But believe it or not, expanded universes aren't all sunshine and roses. They could have some serious issues. Firstly, there's the issue of logic. When you combine two pieces of lore, you might find that in some significant ways they contradict each other. Maybe actually, if we combined Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, it wouldn't make much sense. Why didn't they just fly the X-Wings to Mordor?
Looks like our friends got in.
Also, an expanded universe robs a story of closure. Sure, it's upsetting when we have to say goodbye to characters we love, but it's necessary. The end of The Lord of the Rings is so bittersweet because I don't want to say goodbye to these characters. Whenever I get to the end of a Lord of the Rings marathon, I don't want it to end. But the only thing I want less is for them to continue the series after it had such a perfect ending. One element of the expanded universe could also overshadow another element. If one story is a bit smaller and more intimate and has lower stakes, then that wouldn't work well if it's put in the same continuity and universe as another story with dramatically higher stakes. And the final issue is, of course, tonal inconsistency. Star Wars and Lord of the Rings definitely do have a different feeling to them. I think it is subtle enough that it would take me a while to unpack the exact difference. So to make things easier, imagine if we threw a serious drama into this expanded universe, the Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and Moonlight expanded universe. Well, in that case, you can probably easily imagine that a deep introspective drama like Moonlight just wouldn't work with the fantasy action adventure shenanigans of Star Wars of the Rings. The defining feature of a cinematic universe is containing multiple franchises that could otherwise stand on their own. With that said, I want to now look at the different franchises in the MCU and consider whether they benefit from being part of it, considering the potential benefits and issues I've already laid out. Let's start with Iron Man, where it all began. So looking back, what sticks out is just how solid it is as a standalone movie. The concept of a guy with a robot suit that gives him superpowers works really well. All the villains feel pretty evil and it's satisfying how they're defeated. Also, Tony Stark has a compelling character arc, from a cynical weapons manufacturer and war profiteer to actually developing a conscience and a sense of responsibility. There's this whole political dimension to it as well. Did you ever see that movie Charlie Wilson's War? It's about the complex politics surrounding the decision to fund the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This movie's like that, but with a flying robot suit. It's about a weapons dealer who takes out international terrorist cells acting unilaterally in geopolitical conflicts. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can explore with that, and they continue exploring it into Iron Man 2. But then, well, Iron Man has to go fight an army of space goblins, led by Loki, the Norse trickster god. Iron Man would work well as an intricate, intelligent, and nuanced political drama centered mostly around international terrorism combined with superhero action. But I think such a movie isn't served well by introducing magical characters from Norse mythology. In Iron Man 3, they go on to introduce his panic attack issues, but I always get the feeling in Iron Man 3 that this franchise is really starting to strain against the confines of existing in the MCU. The film can't be specific to Iron Man in the same way anymore, because that would require the universe to be much more grounded than the MCU allows for. It's easy from what we have to imagine a different movie series where the focus stays on a more grounded, realistic conflict and the exploration of Stark's character within that context. That would be a trilogy better serving the Iron Man character, but we can't get that because of the MCU. Iron Man has to fight aliens now. Let's talk about the Hulk. The fact that many people don't even really remember or recognize The Incredible Hulk as an MCU film is probably your first indication this isn't going to go well. See, the Hulk is basically a guy who developed a split personality from growing up in a violent, abusive home. After a classic gamma radiation accident, his more violent personality ends up absorbing the radiation, and now when he flips to that personality, he has superpowers. Now obviously, that could be really interesting. It's basically Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with super strength thrown into the mix. We can have a film series that not only has action, but is also emotionally charged and dark. The issue for Hulk might not be so much getting outpunched by somebody, but instead maybe he accidentally kills someone he loves because he can't control his Hulk personality. You could have a really serious story that focuses on how this ability is a curse that only occasionally benefits him when superpowered villains come along and Hulk is the only one able to defeat them. The issue is, Hulk's gotta punch giant alien monsters every time there's a team-up movie, so this dark side of his character can't be fully explored. Instead, he's mostly just a big strong man and his split personality is most often played for jokes. I've heard some people say that the idea of a Hulk solo movie just wouldn't work. It absolutely would work, just not within the context of the MCU. It would clash tonally with the rest of the universe. Now, as you might have noticed, Thor is one of my go-to examples of how the MCU clashes with what would otherwise be its more grounded stories. And unsurprisingly, I therefore, or should I say therefore, think his character is quite well served in the MCU. Ragnarok is in a sense my favourite Marvel movie because it's the movie that is best served by being part of the MCU. The original Iron Man is great, but not because it's part of the MCU. Very much the opposite. I prefer thinking of it as a standalone movie. Ragnarok, on the other hand, takes all the crazy, disjointed aspects of the MCU and puts them together in a way that's so crazy it circles round to being brilliant. Nonetheless, I still think the character of Thor could at least be just as interesting outside the MCU. I mean, Norse mythology is pretty interesting, and I'm sure they could tell a good story without all the space stuff. The fish out of water element in the first film works well, and I think that idea of a pagan god in the modern world is a crazy enough notion to carry a franchise. However, I still completely get why a lot of people might prefer the whole sci-fi mythology hybrid thing. Like I say, he's my favourite main character within the context of the MCU. Now, the final would-be independent franchise introduced in Phase 1 was Captain America. I'll confess that I don't really know what tone Captain America is supposed to have, because his tone is different in each of the 3 films. I prefer the fun adventure tone of the first Captain America, just because the spy thriller vibe of the sequel feels like it would be more suited to Iron Man, or James Bond for that matter. Either way, my big problem with Captain America in the MCU is that his plot gets sidelined. I mean, Captain America's iconic enemy is Hydra, but they pretty much just become a side quest. They're the villains of the Winter Soldier, but they don't really impact the rest of the universe much. It's the overshadowing issue I mentioned. If Captain America existed in his own franchise, then Hydra could be the single greatest threat within that universe, and him defeating them would seem like a massive deal. Instead, him defeating them is pretty good, but, you know, Thanos is still going to wipe out half the universe. Personally, I do wish with Hydra they'd had the balls to make them straight up Neo bad guys in the 1940s. I'm too small of a channel to be upsetting the algorithm, but you know who I'm talking about. I mean, even in the first Captain America movie, they have Red Skull say he doesn't really care about the Führer's plans. I want a goofy action movie where a super soldier beats up the bad guys in the 1940s and their modern equivalents. Anyway, the second Captain America movie is also the one that struggles most with explaining why the other Avengers aren't getting involved. So it's unsurprising that by the time we get to the third film, it's much more of an Avengers movie than a Captain America movie. One big benefit of the MCU is the ability to introduce characters we probably wouldn't see if it was split up into separate universes. Characters like Black Widow end up bouncing between the main characters. She's first introduced in relation to Iron Man, then she teams up with Captain America, and then she has a romantic connection with the Hulk. There's also somebody like Hawkeye who would struggle to carry his own franchise. Then there's Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, and the Guardians of the Galaxy, who have solo films, but benefit from being part of the MCU because they're all pretty wacky characters. I can understand somebody saying that the MCU was worth it because it meant these smaller characters got a chance to shine and draw in the crowds, when they probably wouldn't have in a different comic book movie landscape where every character was expected to go it alone in their own franchise. But yeah, I guess that's a comprehensive analysis of all the major characters and how they fit into the MCU. Wait a minute, I forgot about Spider-Man! How could I forget Spider-Man? He's one of the most iconic superheroes of all time, a lot of people's favourite, because he's the ultimate escapist fantasy. He's a teenage kid who has a lot of relatable problems. He isn't that popular, he's got a crush on a girl who barely knows he exists, and he even has money troubles. But then he gets bitten by a spider and he suddenly gets all these incredible powers. From the first moment I saw a Spider-Man movie, I decided I would never again tell anybody if I got a strange bug bite and a really strong reaction to it. I don't want medical records tipping my nemesis off when I get superpowers. Just imagine yourself swinging around the city, stopping crimes, having upside down kisses with Kirsten Dunst. It's the only story that still truly makes me feel like a kid in the best way possible. Now, the MCU takes the story of Spider-Man, the superhero who everybody would give anything to be, and says, yeah, I think I know what angle we're going to go with for this one. We're going to focus on how boring it would be to be Spider-Man. Spider-Man is completely ruined by being in the MCU, because the point of Spider-Man is how awesome it would be. But compared to the rest of the MCU, fighting street-level crime in New York City seems kind of unimpressive. Again, it's that overshadowing issue. The thing is, Homecoming on balance was really good. Vulture is a really interesting villain with a sympathetic motive, Peter has some relatable high school issues, Aunt May is hot, Ned is a really funny addition, a lot of the jokes are pretty funny actually, the action is still as dynamic and interesting as ever with Spider-Man's unique web powers, and Aunt May is physically attractive.
He loves you.
Finally! The second film is also pretty good. All the same characters are present, the villain is again interesting in terms of his powers and the way he uses them against Spider-Man, but we can start to see the MCU creeping in here in a negative way. Don't forget that this movie functions within the context of the MCU as a world tour to show how Thanos killing 50% of all people on Earth didn't actually do anything, but the wasted opportunity of the blip is a gripe for a future video. In general, the disappointing aspect of these movies is everything that relates them to the MCU MCU. Spider-Man's main motivation is to be an Avenger. Like, Spider-Man, the hero that every kid wants to be, has the primary motivation of thinking, man, this sucks, I wish I was an Avenger. His big sad moment in the first movie is when Tony Stark chastises him and takes his suit away. Spider-Man is supposed to be your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and that's supposed to be awesome, not some purgatorial punishment for a kid who really just wants to be an Avenger. He's not supposed to be a guy who gets a special suit from a billionaire and spends a whole film agonizing over how he's going to carry on his legacy. And then you have No Way Home, which is a fun movie, but it just reminds you that these movies are more about fun than they are about telling a deep story that really immerses you in the complete story of a specific character. The movies aren't terrible, they're all pretty good, but for the first two definitely, they're good in a way where the well-done Spider-Man elements are compensating for the negatives of being in the MCU. Spider-Man is probably the best example of a character who doesn't at all benefit from being in the MCU, and indeed, being in the MCU actually counts against him and makes him so much less interesting than if he was in his own universe, where being that quippy New York web-slinger really was the height of awesome. I don't think that cinematic universes are an intrinsically bad idea. I've already explained they can have benefits. The issue is I think the MCU for the most part doesn't have as much potential for these benefits as other cinematic universes. Let's explore other prominent cinematic universes and why I think they were much better ideas than the MCU. Firstly, let's start with DC. Obviously, they're the main rival to Marvel, so they're the best point of comparison. The big difference is most DC characters seem to have the same basic tone. Wonder Woman, Aquaman, The Flash, they all have that Superman vibe going on. Also, the characters tend to have their own realms, so you can come up with more logical explanations for solo movies. We don't need to wonder where The Flash is in an Aquaman movie. He can't breathe underwater. Batman is the main exception to all this. He'd need to be powered up to be credible as a hero, but he's not a friendly neighborhood Batman by any means, so it doesn't interfere with his character too much if he takes on larger threats. He's also obviously the most tonally distinct character, which might clash with the Justice League. I think the best solution to this is to make him an older Batman, as we saw in the Snyderverse, so he would have mellowed out a bit with age. And then if you want a grittier, scrappier, darker Batman, you can simply set that when he was younger and all these other DC superheroes weren't a known presence yet. Although if I'm being honest, my enthusiasm for tonal consistency is so profound that I'd rather that version of Batman be set in a completely different universe, because if you take something like The Dark Knight, if you told me that Aquaman exists in this universe, even if he is just doing his own thing and doesn't intersect with Batman at all, knowing he exists in the same universe would still annoy me. Like this gritty crime drama is going on, but meanwhile a giant CGI crab army is fighting an army of shark riders. I don't like that. Anyway, obviously the DCEU ended up majorly fumbling the bag, but I don't think that's because the universe was a bad idea. It's because the execution was a disaster. Firstly, they never settled on a tone by trying to find some halfway point between Marvel's tone and the tone of the Nolan Batman movies, and you end up with this awkward half-serious, half-jokey mess. Also, they totally rushed things and gave the characters no room to breathe, but I think the DC Expanded Universe should have worked. What about the Monsterverse? I mean, tonally that works fine because they're all just the same types of movies. Monster movies about giant destructive monsters. King Kong is a slight exception because it's sort of hard to marry the somber portrayal of King Kong in the traditional story with the idea that him doing that exact same stuff in a different context is purely epic without that somber note. But generally speaking, if you're willing to ignore the fact that the King Kong story isn't supposed to be about a giant ape that smashes up major cities, you're left with the achievable goal of having an expanded universe where various giant monsters just smash things up. There's all sorts you could do in terms of introducing the monsters and expanding on the lore of where they came from and why they're rising up now. You could do prequels about Polynesian sailors encountering giant sea monsters, or Australian aborigines meeting a giant lizard and being completely unfazed by it because that's just a typical day in Australia. Many opportunities for prequels and crossovers and making this universe more expansive. I did find it a bit weird that Legendary introduced Godzilla in his first movie as fighting another monster. That seemed a bit premature considering you'd think that's something they'd want to build up to. I think the best strategy for your average MonsterVerse movie would be to view the monsters as forces of nature and focus on the characterization of the humans on the ground so that we feel the impact of the destruction more intensely. If I were in charge of the Monsterverse, my big point would be to say, write the characters so well that you would have a compelling drama even without the monsters, and then when we add the monsters, people will be really invested. But either way, I think it's pretty obvious that the Monsterverse could easily work, and indeed it has in fact been the most successful expanded universe after the MCU. On the other end of the spectrum though, we have the Dark Universe. The attempt to make an expanded universe out of the Universal monsters. Now, in some sense, I shouldn't need to tell you that this is a good idea, because it was the original expanded universe. Universal made so many of these movies back in the 30s and 40s. How did they mess it up so badly when trying to reinvigorate it? Well, they tried to make the movies into action-adventure nonsense, presumably because they wanted to copy Marvel. What they should have done is fully committed to making them horrors. R-rated, low-budget, gory horrors. Within that context, the tonal consistency issue takes care of itself. Every movie is going to be a horror because all the franchises are horror franchises. And with this strategy, they could have dominated every Halloween. Just make decent horror movies that function as horror movies, and then get the benefit on top of that of having some kind of substantial and interconnected plot. Also, having characters crossing over becomes a big selling point here, because most horror movies fail from having boring, cliched characters. In this case, you can set up the characters in one movie and have some of them appear in another, so the viewer is already partially invested in the movie just based on having characters they already know show up. Honestly, if I could be in charge of any expanded cinematic universe, it would be this. Even though it's the one that actually flopped the hardest, I think it has the most potential, and it would be a lot of fun working out how these different horror movies would interweave with each other to build up to some larger crossover event. I guess the only other expanded universe would be the X-Men universe. Definitely most of these movies have the same tone. The one exception would be the Deadpool movies, but they're supposed to be tonally jarring, so that's fine. There are loads of characters, and because only a few of them are really major characters, you can actually have any of them die in any of the movies in a way that could keep the audience on their toes. But the great thing about the X-Men is that the whole universe they inhabit is centered around this specific question of what's to be done politically about the reality of mutants existing. They're sort of a perfect example of why dramatically expanding a universe is a bad idea. If you expanded the X-Men universe to include other universes, you would have to sacrifice the singular focus the X-Men universe places on its central conflict. It would really take away from the series as a whole. By the way, X-Men is now going to become part of the MCU, and I have no idea how that's going to work logically, because where were the X-Men this whole time while the Avengers were existing? And the Eternals, for that matter. I'm sure that taking a cinematic universe that references one of the worst crimes against humanity ever committed, and combining that with what we see in the MCU, won't completely undercut the core moments of emotional resonance that make X-Men truly interesting to watch. Of course, the one thing I should acknowledge is that arguably X-Men isn't really an expanded universe and is more of a singular franchise in its own right. Which makes sense because it is the most tonally and logically consistent, and maybe the fact it achieved that by not attaching itself to a wider cinematic universe is a broader lesson in general about how expanded universes aren't actually a great idea most of the time. My first video on this channel was me rewriting Star Wars, and generally I'd say I want a main focus of this channel to be rewrites and reworkings of content, which is born out of the, I guess, kind of arrogant belief that I could most of the time do a lot better than what these studios put out. But the thing is, I don't think that about the MCU. I don't think I could take this idea of the MCU and do any better with it than Marvel did. Despite my complaints, I want to reiterate that the Infinity Saga did turn out incredible. A lot of the characters could have had more interesting stories told if they were in their own separate universe, but the fact that putting all these characters together in one universe worked at all is really impressive. I think the real takeaway here is that the main issue Hollywood has is hubris. The MCU shouldn't have worked, and was an incredibly ambitious idea, and it's clear that because of that, a lot of effort and creativity was put into making it work. By contrast, all these other cinematic universes have been much less successful, despite being on paper better ideas. Why? I suspect because they came into it thinking, well, we'll just do what Marvel did and we'll have a big success on our hands. They didn't bother with the effort or the creativity, and they've paid the price for it. 20 years ago, nobody would believe that a Captain America movie would be more successful than a movie where Batman fights Superman. The real lesson Hollywood needs to learn is a bad idea executed well will beat out a good idea executed poorly every single time. Anyway, I guess that's the end of the video. Please do all the algorithm things because that really helps me out. I also would highly recommend that you watch my Star Wars sequel trilogy rewrite series because it's really good and not that many people have seen it. And of course, on that note, make sure to subscribe in case one of my future videos is good because I could surprise you.